High Counselor Velthari stood before the massive viewing screen in the command center of HFY as enemy ships filled the dark space beyond their world. The Keith Empire fleet stretched across the horizon like a swarm of angry metal insects, each ship bigger than the largest Velari vessels. Their weapons glowed with deadly energy that could turn entire cities into glass and ash. The final battle for her people's survival was about to begin, and she knew they would lose. The Velari had been a peaceful species for over 2,000 years. They built beautiful cities that floated among the clouds, created art that could make even the coldest hearts weep, and shared their knowledge freely with any who asked. They had no weapons capable of fighting the Keth war machine. Their defensive shields were failing under constant bombardment, and their evacuation ships had been destroyed in the first wave of attacks. There was nowhere to run, and nothing left to fight with. Velthari walked slowly to the ancient vault beneath the command center where her people kept their most dangerous secrets. The heavy doors opened with a sound like thunder and revealed a chamber filled with artifacts from dead civilizations. In the center of the room sat a device that looked like a crystal star with metal wings. It pulsed with a faint blue light that seemed to call to something deep in her mind. The device was called the Dimensional Beacon, and it had been found in the ruins of a civilization that had vanished long before the Velari had learned to fly between the stars. The record said it could summon protectors from across space and time when a species faced complete destruction. 3 times in galactic history the beacon had been used, and 3 times entire wars had ended in ways no one expected. The records also warned that those who used the beacon paid a price that was sometimes worse than death itself. Velthari placed her hands on the smooth surface of the device and felt its alien warmth flow through her fingers. The Keth Empire would kill every Velari man, woman, and child if she did nothing. At least with the beacon there was hope that someone somewhere might care enough to help. She pressed her palm against the activation panel and spoke the ancient words that would send their call across the void. The beacon came alive with light that hurt to look at directly. Energy flowed through circuits that had been built by minds that thought in ways no living species could understand. The device began to sing in harmonies that existed in dimensions beyond normal space, and the sound grew louder until the entire chamber shook with its power. Reality itself seemed to bend around the beacon as it tore holes in space and time to carry its message to distant worlds. The signal that erupted from HFY was not like any distress call that had ever been sent before. It did not beg for help or offer payment for rescue. Instead, it reached out with invisible hands to grab the minds of those who heard it and filled them with images of war and death and the desperate need to fight. The beacon searched across the galaxy for a very specific type of species, one that had learned to survive where others would die, one that treated violence as a tool rather than a last resort. Admiral Kim Jiwoo was reviewing supply reports aboard her flagship when the signal hit her mind like a hammer blow. Every screen on the bridge of the TDF Indomitable went white with static as the beacon's message burned itself into the ship's computers. The Admiral fell to her knees as images flooded. Her thoughts, pictures of a beautiful world under attack by an empire that killed for pleasure. She saw cities burning and innocent people dying, and felt something ancient and terrible wake up in her chest. Around her, the bridge crew was having the same experience. Lieutenant Commander Park Hyun gripped his console so hard his knuckles turned white as the beacon showed him fleets of enemy ships destroying everything in their path. Engineer Oh Seungmin stared at his instruments in shock as every warning light on the ship began flashing at once. The beacon was not just sending a message, it was changing them, awakening instincts that their species had carried since the days when they hunted with stones and sticks. Captain Lee Minho felt the signal reach his carrier Busan Victory like a physical blow that knocked him backward into his command chair. The images in his mind were so real he could smell smoke from burning buildings and hear the screams of the dying. His hands moved without conscious thought to activate the ship's war protocols as something deep in his DNA responded to the call for violence. This was not a request for help. It was a summons to war, and every human who heard it felt their blood sing with the need to answer. The beacon signal spread through Earth's defense fleet like wildfire, jumping from ship to ship and mind to mind. On the destroyer Soul's Fury, Captain Park Hyun watched his crew transform before his eyes as the alien message awakened the predator that lived in every human heart. Weapons Officer Nam Sua began calculating firing solutions for enemies she had never seen, while Navigation Specialist Bei Jinho plotted jump coordinates to a star system he had never heard of. Admiral Kim Jiwoo struggled to her feet and looked around the bridge at her officers, who were all staring at her with the same expression of barely controlled violence. The beacon had shown them prey, and every instinct they possessed was screaming at them to hunt. She opened communications to the rest of the fleet and saw the same look in the eyes of every captain on her screen. The signal had not asked for their help. It had demanded their presence, and something in their nature made it impossible to refuse. Commander Choi Woo-bin, aboard the reconnaissance vessel Ghost of Seoul, was the first to understand what was happening. His ship's sensors had recorded the beacon's transmission, and his computers were already translating the alien message. The signal contained coordinates to a distant star system and detailed information about an ongoing war between two species he had never heard of. What made his blood run cold was the realization that the beacon was not asking them to stop the war. It was ordering them to finish it. Within hours, Earth's military machine began to move with an efficiency that would have terrified their enemies if they had been able to see it. Supply ships loaded weapons and ammunition, while troop transports prepared for immediate departure. The beacon had awakened something in humanity that their allies had never seen, and their enemies had never imagined. They were no longer the peaceful explorers who had joined the galactic community seeking friendship and trade. They were the apex predators of a death world, and they had been called to hunt. The dimensional fold generators aboard Admiral Kim's flagship began to charge as her fleet prepared to jump across space to answer the beacon's call. She did not know what they would find when they arrived or what price they would have to pay for responding to the summons. All she knew was that somewhere in the darkness between the stars, innocent people were dying, and someone had called for the one species in the galaxy that knew how to kill efficiently and without mercy. As the fleet prepared to depart, Admiral Kim looked one last time at the message the beacon had burned into her mind. The images of war and death and desperate need still blazed behind her eyes like a fire that could not be put out. The Valari Republic had called for protectors, and they would get them. But protection was a service that humanity had always provided at a very high price. Admiral Zephan of the Keth Empire stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final bombardment of SciFiPrime's orbital defenses, when his sensors officer suddenly went rigid with fear. The young Keth warrior was staring at his instruments, with the kind of expression that came just before someone delivered very bad news. Zephan walked over to the sensor station and looked at the readings that were making his officer tremble. Massive energy signatures were approaching the Thesia system from a direction that should have been empty space. The readings showed at least 50 ships moving at speeds that made no sense according to Keth's understanding of physics. Even more disturbing was the fact that these ships were not trying to hide their approach. They were announcing their presence with energy emissions so powerful that they could be detected from 3 star systems away. The unknown fleet dropped out of dimensional fold space at the edge of the Thesia system, like predators emerging from tall grass. Admiral Kim Jiwoo's flagship TDF Indomitable led the formation, its hull scarred by battles fought in the depths of space where light never reached. Behind it came dozens of warships that looked like they had been built for one purpose only: to destroy anything that threatened their makers. Captain Lee Minho's carrier Busan Victory deployed fighter squadrons that moved through space with an aggressiveness that made veteran Keth pilots nervous. The small craft darted between asteroids and debris with maneuvers that should have killed their pilots from acceleration forces alone. What made it worse was the casual way they performed these impossible stunts, as if flying through a death trap was just another day at work. On Thesia Prime, Communications Officer Yang Sori was monitoring the approach of the unknown fleet when she realized what she was looking at. She had studied the military histories of dozens of galactic species, and she recognized the configuration of ships that were designed by a civilization that had never known peace. These were not exploration vessels or even normal warships. They were the products of a species that had learned to fight before they had learned to farm. The human fleet spread out across the system in a formation that covered every possible escape route while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Admiral Kim divided her forces into 3 battle groups that could support each other, while preventing any enemy ships from fleeing the system. It was a deployment pattern that spoke of thousands of years of experience in space warfare and a mindset that viewed every enemy as something to be completely destroyed, rather than simply defeated. Commander Choi Woo-bin aboard the Ghost of Seoul conducted the first detailed scans of the battlefield and transmitted his findings back to Admiral Kim. His reports were delivered in the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had seen too much violence to be surprised by anything. He identified Keth fleet positions, weapon types, defensive capabilities, and civilian population centers with the methodical precision of a butcher examining cuts of meat. Admiral Zephon intercepted some of these transmissions and felt something cold settle in his stomach as he listened to the humans discussing orbital bombardment patterns and acceptable casualty rates. These newcomers talked about war the way other species talked about weather, as a natural force that could be predicted and controlled with the right knowledge and tools. They were not here to negotiate or mediate. They were here to solve a problem using the only method they truly understood. Captain Nam Sua of the cruiser Daegu Thunderbolt began deploying sensor networks throughout the system, while her weapons officer calculated firing solutions for every Keth ship in range. Her crew worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from endless practice in real combat situations. They checked and double-checked their equipment not because they were nervous, but because they knew that sloppy preparation led to unnecessary casualties among their own people. The Keth Empire had built its reputation on overwhelming force and the willingness to use violence without mercy. They had conquered 17 star systems by destroying anyone who resisted and enslaving those who surrendered. Their ships carried weapons capable of turning planets into radioactive wastelands, and their soldiers were trained to show no compassion for the weak. They had never encountered a species that treated war as a science rather than an art. Captain Bei Jinho reviewed tactical data from the Valari Republic's databases and began formulating what humans called standard pacification protocols. His plans involved orbital bombardment of military targets, disruption of enemy supply lines, and the systematic elimination of command and control structures. The protocols had been developed over centuries of conflict and refined through practical application against enemies who fought with everything from stone knives to antimatter weapons. High Counselor Velthari watched the human fleet take positions around her world and felt a growing sense of unease. The ships that had answered her desperate call were nothing like the peaceful vessels of the Galactic Alliance. They moved with predatory grace and carried weapons that could crack moons in half. She began to wonder if summoning these strangers had been a mistake that would cost her people more than defeat by the Keth Empire. Admiral Zephon decided to test the newcomers by demonstrating Keth military might on one of SciFiPrime's smaller moons. He ordered his heaviest battleship to target the moon with its primary plasma cannon and reduce a mountain range to molten slag. The display of raw destructive power had always been enough to convince other species that resistance was futile. The human response was immediate and proportional in a way that made every Keth officer on the bridge step backward from their stations. Captain Kang Minji of the destroyer Gwangju's Revenge fired a single kinetic bombardment round that struck the Keth battleship's weapon emplacement with surgical precision. The impact vaporized the entire forward section of the enemy vessel and sent debris streaming across space in a glittering cloud of twisted metal. What terrified the Keth was not the power of the human weapon, but the casual way it had been used. Captain Kang had not issued warnings or demanded surrender. She had simply removed a threat with the same emotional investment that someone might use to swat an annoying insect. The humans were not angry or excited about the violence. They were treating it as routine maintenance of battlefield conditions. Engineer Oh Seungmin aboard Admiral Kim's flagship was already calculating resource requirements for extended operations in the Thesia system. His reports covered everything from ammunition resupply to the establishment of forward operating bases on asteroids and dead worlds. The humans were not planning a quick rescue mission. They were preparing for a war of extermination that might last for years. Squadron leader Han Tai-yong led his fighter wing on reconnaissance flights around the Keth fleet and transmitted detailed intelligence reports back to the human command ships. His pilots flew through plasma fire and particle beam arrays without losing a single craft, while gathering information about enemy defensive capabilities. They moved through the combat zone like sharks circling prey, fast and deadly, and utterly, without fear. The psychological impact on both sides became clear as the two fleets maneuvered for position. The Volari realized that they had summoned something far more dangerous than their current enemies, while the Keth discovered that their reputation for ruthless violence meant nothing to a species that had perfected the art of war on a world where everything tried to kill them every day. Admiral Kim opened communications with both fleets and delivered a message that contained no threats or demands, just a simple statement of fact. The Volari Republic had summoned them, and they had answered. That summons, according to the ancient protocols. The Keth Empire could withdraw from the system immediately, or they could be removed by force. There would be no negotiations, no prisoner exchanges, and no mercy for those who chose to fight. As the human fleet completed its deployment around SciFiPrime, it became clear that this would not be a normal space battle between civilized species, fighting for territory or resources. This would be an extermination carried out by the most efficient killers the galaxy had ever produced against an empire that had never learned the difference between conquest and survival. Admiral Kim Ji-woo activated the fleet communication array and sent her message to both the Volari Republic and the Keth Empire with the kind of directness that left no room for misunderstanding. Her words were simple and delivered without emotion or diplomatic ceremony. The Volari had activated an ancient beacon that summoned her fleet across dimensional space, and they had responded to that summons according to protocols that were older than most galactic civilizations. High Counselor, Felthari received the human transmission in her command center and felt relief flood through her body despite the growing concerns about what kind of help she had actually summoned. The humans were offering to save her people from complete extermination, and that was all that mattered in the immediate crisis. She quickly assigned liaison Yoon Ji-ho to coordinate with the human fleet and provide them with any intelligence they needed to defeat the Keith invasion force. Yoon Ji-ho was a veteran diplomat who had spent decades negotiating with dozens of different species across the galaxy. He understood the subtle nuances of interstellar politics and the careful dance of words that kept civilizations from destroying each other over minor disagreements. He was completely unprepared for his first conversation with Captain Lee Min-ho, aboard the human carrier Busan Victory. The human captain greeted him with polite efficiency and immediately began asking questions that made Yoon's diplomatic training useless. Lee wanted detailed maps of Keth military installations, complete specifications for their weapons and defensive systems, and exact population counts for every world in the enemy empire. When Yoon tried to suggest that perhaps they should first attempt diplomatic negotiations, Lee looked at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for someone who had suggested using flower petals to stop a plasma cannon. Captain Nam, Suwa of the cruiser Daegu Thunderbolt, requested access to Volari databases containing information about Keth supply lines, troop movements, and command structures. Her questions were delivered with the professional courtesy of someone asking for routine information rather than state secrets. She wanted to know which Keth worlds produced food, which manufactured weapons, and which served as communication hubs for their military network. Yoon began to realize that the humans were not planning to simply drive the Keth away from SciFiPrime. They were gathering intelligence for a campaign that would systematically dismantle the entire Keth Empire piece by piece, until nothing remained that could threaten anyone ever again. When he asked Captain Nam about the possibility of negotiating a ceasefire, she explained patiently that ceasefire agreements only worked with species that could be trusted to honor them. Admiral Zephon of the Keth Empire received Admiral Kim's message and initially dismissed it as the usual bluster from another inferior species that did not understand Keth military superiority. He had heard similar demands from dozens of civilizations before crushing them into radioactive dust. He decided to demonstrate Keth power by destroying one of SciFiPrime's cities and broadcasting the footage to the human fleet. The Keth bombardment turned the beautiful floating city of New Harmony into a crater filled with molten glass and twisted metal. 30,000 Volari civilians died in the attack, and Admiral Zephon transmitted images of their deaths to Admiral Kim, along with a demand that the human fleet withdraw or face the same fate. He expected the newcomers to either flee in terror or waste time with useless diplomatic protests. Admiral Kim's response arrived 60 seconds later in the form of kinetic bombardment rounds that struck 3 Keth battleships simultaneously. The projectiles moved at a significant fraction of light speed and hit with enough force to crack the enemy vessels in half before their crews even realized they were under attack. The human admiral then sent a brief message explaining that the Keth had just demonstrated why negotiation was not an option. Captain Bei Jinho began implementing what humans called standard pacification protocols, while communications officer Yang Sori on SciFiPrime monitored the transmissions with growing horror. The humans discussed orbital bombardment patterns, acceptable collateral damage percentages, and resource extraction rates with the casual efficiency of professionals who had performed these calculations thousands of times before. Yang had studied the military histories of every major galactic civilization, and she recognized the signs of a species that had never known peace. The humans planned their wars the way other species planned construction projects, with detailed timelines, resource allocations, and contingency plans for every possible outcome. They were not here to rescue the Valari Republic. They were here to claim territory and eliminate competition. Commander Choi Wubin of the reconnaissance vessel, Ghost of Seoul, transmitted detailed intelligence reports about Keth fleet dispositions and defensive capabilities to Admiral Kim. His analysis was thorough and professional, and completely focused on how to kill the enemy most efficiently. He identified weak points in Keth ship designs, vulnerabilities in their formation patterns, and optimal targeting priorities for maximum psychological impact. The Keth began to understand that they were facing something unprecedented when their attempts to intimidate the human fleet resulted in the methodical destruction of their forward screening elements. Captain Kang Minji of the destroyer Gwangju's Revenge eliminated Keth patrol ships with single shots that removed them from existence so completely that their debris fields could barely be detected by sensors. High Counselor Velthari met with Liaison Yoon Jiho in her private chambers and listened to his report about human military capabilities with a growing sense of dread. The species she had summoned to save her people were not the kind of allies she had hoped for. They were efficient killers who treated warfare as a business transaction and conquest as a routine administrative procedure. Yoon explained that the humans had requested detailed information about Valari industrial capacity, mineral resources, and population distribution. They wanted to know which worlds could support human colonies, which had strategic value for future military operations, and which could be converted to supply bases for extended campaigns. When he had asked about their long-term intentions, Captain Lee had smiled and suggested that such matters could be discussed after the immediate threat had been eliminated. Captain Im Young-won of the battleship Ulsan's Pride demonstrated humanity's approach to space superiority by engaging a Keth heavy cruiser in single combat. The enemy vessel was larger and carried more weapons, but the human captain used tactics that no civilized species would consider honorable. He targeted the enemy ship's life support systems, disabled their escape pods, and then systematically destroyed their weapon mounts while keeping them alive to suffer. Engineer Oh Sung-min and his construction crews began surveying asteroids and dead worlds throughout the Thesia system for potential mining operations and base construction. His teams worked through combat zones and radiation fields with casual disregard for hazards that would force other species to retreat to safe distances. They collected samples, performed geological surveys, and marked locations for future development while battles raged around them. The psychological warfare became more intense as the humans demonstrated their complete lack of concern for Keth. Military traditions and honor codes. Squadron leader Han Taeyong led fighter attacks that specifically targeted Keth command ships and communication arrays while avoiding direct confrontation with their strongest vessels. The Keth found themselves unable to coordinate their forces or maintain unit cohesion as their leadership structure collapsed around them. Admiral Zephon realized that his empire was facing an enemy that fought wars the way natural disasters struck, planets with remorseless efficiency and total disregard for anything except achieving their objectives. The humans did not seek glory or honor or revenge. They simply wanted to remove obstacles that stood in their way. Every Keth ship that stayed in the system was an obstacle that would be removed with the minimum expenditure of human resources. The Battle for SciFiPrime became a demonstration of two completely different philosophies of warfare. The Keth fought for dominance and the right to rule over lesser species through superior firepower and ruthless violence. The humans fought for survival and the elimination of threats using methods that had been perfected over millions of years of evolution on a world that tried to kill everything that lived on it. Young. Sori intercepted human communications discussing post-battle procedures and felt her blood turn cold as she realized what would happen after the Keth were defeated. The humans were not planning to leave once the immediate threat was eliminated. They intended to establish permanent installations throughout the system and gradually expand their influence until the Valari Republic became another province in a growing human empire. The battle for SciFiPrime began at dawn, when Admiral Kim Jiwoo gave the order that would transform the system into a graveyard for the Keth Empire. Her fleet had spent 3 days preparing for what humans called standard Deathworld conflict resolution, a process that involved the systematic elimination of enemy forces using methods that most galactic civilizations considered war crimes. The humans did not consider them war crimes because they had never signed treaties that limited their right to survive. Captain Lee Minho launched his fighter squadrons from the carrier Busan Victory and watched on his tactical displays as human. Pilots performed maneuvers that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about the limits of biological tolerance. Squadron leader Han Taeyong led his wing through acceleration forces that should have liquefied his internal organs while executing attack patterns that treated radiation exposure and debris impacts as minor annoyances. The Keth interceptor pilots tried to engage the human fighters in traditional combat and discovered that their opponents had redefined the meaning of aggressive flying. Han's pilots dove through plasma fire that would have vaporized most spacecraft while returning fire with weapons that seemed to ignore conventional physics. They performed rolls and turns that generated gravitational forces capable of crushing normal creatures into paste while maintaining perfect formation discipline. Meanwhile, Colonel Shin Ryujin prepared her ground assault teams for deployment to Keth-occupied territories on SciFiPrime's largest moon. Her soldiers checked their equipment with the methodical precision of people who had trained for combat in environments that actively tried to kill them. They loaded ammunition designed to penetrate advanced armor, activated life support systems that could function in toxic atmospheres, and calibrated sensors that worked in conditions that would blind or deafen other species. The first wave of human ground troops landed in the middle of a Keth military base during the height of an ion storm that had forced all other combatants to seek shelter. Shin's soldiers moved through the electrical chaos with casual efficiency, while the Keth defenders struggled to operate their equipment in conditions that interfered with their technology. The humans had learned to fight on a world where ion storms were considered mild weather. Admiral Zifan watched his carefully planned defensive positions collapse as human forces attacked from directions and in conditions that no sane military commander would consider viable. His troops were being defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by an enemy that treated his most devastating environmental weapons as routine operating conditions. When he deployed chemical weapons that could kill most organic life forms, the human soldiers simply adjusted their filtration systems and continued advancing. Engineer Oh Sung-min and his construction crews began building forward operating bases in locations that both Valari and Keth military experts had declared uninhabitable. His teams worked through bombardments and radiation exposure while setting up supply depots and communication arrays that would support extended human operations throughout the system. They treated the construction of military installations in active combat zones as routine engineering problems. The psychological impact on the Keth became apparent when entire units began retreating without engaging human forces. Word spread through their ranks about soldiers who could survive in vacuum for extended periods, who fought effectively in gravitational fields that would crush normal beings, and who seemed to treat battlefield conditions that would panic veteran warriors as minor inconveniences that required modest adjustments to their procedures. Captain Im Young-won of the battleship Ulsan's Pride demonstrated humanity's approach to naval warfare by engaging 3 Keth heavy cruisers simultaneously, while his ship sustained damage that would have forced any other vessel to withdraw from combat. His crew continued fighting effectively, while exposed to radiation levels that would have been immediately fatal to most galactic species, repairing critical systems while under fire, and maintaining weapons accuracy despite hull breaches that vented atmosphere into space. Communications Officer Yang Sori monitored human tactical communications and realized that she was listening to a species that had never learned to separate military operations from normal daily activities. The humans discussed combat casualties with the same emotional detachment that other species used for equipment maintenance reports. They calculated acceptable loss ratios and resource expenditure rates while fighting battles that would have been remembered as epic struggles by any other civilization. The tide of war shifted decisively when Captain Kang Minji led a squadron of human destroyers in an attack that the Keth had assumed was impossible. Her ships approached through a debris field created by the destruction of a small moon, navigating at speeds that should have resulted in catastrophic collisions while maintaining formation integrity that allowed them to coordinate their fire on specific target systems rather than simply trying to achieve general destruction. Commander Choi Woo-bin of the Ghost of Seoul provided real-time intelligence updates that allowed human forces to anticipate Keth tactical decisions before the enemy commanders had finished making them. His reconnaissance teams operated in areas of space that were considered impassable due to gravitational anomalies and radiation fields, gathering information that gave Admiral Kim a complete picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. The Keth discovered that their traditional strategy of overwhelming inferior opponents with massive firepower was useless against an enemy that had evolved to survive on a world where massive firepower was a natural weather phenomenon. Human ships continued fighting effectively while sustaining damage that would have destroyed vessels designed by any other species, their crews working with practiced efficiency to maintain combat effectiveness under conditions that would have been immediately fatal to most galactic life forms. Colonel Shin's ground forces began eliminating Keth strongholds with tactics that combined advanced technology with primitive ruthlessness in ways that terrified civilized observers. Her soldiers used orbital bombardment to create tactical advantages, deployed weapons that could function in environments where conventional electronics failed, and advanced through defensive positions while exposed to hazards that would have required other species to wear protective equipment so bulky it would have made combat impossible. Captain Nam Sua of the cruiser, Daegu Thunderbolt coordinated naval gunfire support for ground operations with a precision that allowed her to provide close fire support to human infantry units while they were engaged in hand-to-hand combat with enemy forces. Her weapons officers calculated targeting solutions that placed explosive rounds within meters of friendly forces without causing casualties, a level of accuracy that required absolute confidence in both technology and training. The final phase of the battle began when Admiral Kim ordered the implementation of what humans called total systems disruption, a strategy that involved the simultaneous destruction of every military, industrial, and communication facility that supported Keth operations in the Thesia system. The attack was coordinated across multiple star systems and executed with timing precision that demonstrated centuries of experience in conducting complex military operations against technologically sophisticated opponents. Engineer O's construction. Teams had been building the infrastructure necessary to support extended human operations throughout the battle, working under fire to establish supply lines and communication networks that would allow Admiral Kim to maintain her forces in the system indefinitely. His crews treated the construction of permanent military installations during active combat as a routine logistical challenge that required only modest adjustments to standard operating procedures. Admiral Zephon realized that his empire was facing something that had never existed in galactic history, a species that had learned to fight before they had learned to think, that treated warfare as a natural biological function rather than a political tool. The humans were not trying to defeat the Keth Empire. They were trying to eliminate it completely because that was the only way they knew how to ensure their own survival. The battle ended not with surrender or negotiation, but with the complete destruction of every Keth military asset in the Thesia system. The few enemy ships that attempted to retreat were hunted down and eliminated by human forces that pursued them through hyperspace using tracking methods that no other species had ever developed. Admiral Kim's fleet had not won a victory. They had performed an extermination. The silence that followed the destruction of the last Keth ship was more terrifying to High Counselor Velthari than the sound of battle had been. Admiral Kim Ji-woo's fleet hung in space around SciFiPrime, like a collection of sleeping predators. Their weapons powered down, but their sensors still scanning every corner of the system for potential threats. The humans had eliminated the Keith Empire's presence with such complete efficiency that it seemed impossible that a war had actually taken place. Admiral Kim requested a meeting with the Valari leadership to discuss what she called post-conflict administrative procedures. Her message was delivered with the same polite professionalism that she had used throughout the crisis, but Valthari could sense something different in the human commander's tone. The desperate urgency that had driven the rescue operation was gone, replaced by the methodical patience of someone who had important business to conduct and unlimited time to complete it. Liaison Yoon Ji-ho accompanied High Counselor Valthari aboard Admiral Kim's flagship and immediately noticed that the human crew was not celebrating their victory or preparing to return home. Instead, they were conducting detailed scans of every planet and moon in the system, while their engineering teams continued building installations that looked designed for permanent occupation rather than temporary military operations. Admiral Kim greeted the Valari delegation in her conference room with refreshments and courteous conversation before explaining the situation with the kind of directness that left no room for misunderstanding. The dimensional beacon that had summoned her fleet was not a simple distress call, but an ancient contract that bound both parties to specific obligations. The Valari had requested protection, and the humans had provided it, but protection was a service that required ongoing payment and supervision. Engineer Oh Seung-min presented detailed reports about mineral resources throughout the Thesia system and explained that human forces would need to establish mining operations to support their continued presence in the region. His analysis covered everything from rare metal deposits on uninhabited moons to energy sources that could power the defensive installations necessary to prevent future Keth incursions or attacks by other hostile species. Captain Lee Min-ho outlined plans for converting several asteroids into manufacturing facilities that would produce weapons and equipment for the human garrison forces. His proposals included the construction of shipyards capable of building replacement vessels for the fleet and research stations, where human scientists could study local conditions and develop new technologies suited to operations in this part of the galaxy. Yoon Ji-ho listened to these presentations with growing alarm and finally asked the question that he had been dreading since the first human ship had arrived in their system. He wanted to know what would happen to Valari sovereignty and independence once the humans had established permanent installations throughout their territory. Admiral Kim smiled and explained that sovereignty was a luxury that species could only afford when they were capable of defending themselves. High Counselor Valthari realized that she had made a terrible mistake when she activated the dimensional beacon, but it was far too late to change the consequences of that decision. The ancient device had not summoned rescuers who would save her people and then depart. It had summoned conquerors who protected their investments by claiming them as permanent property. The beacon was not a call for help. It was a contract for annexation. Captain Song Kaidi arrived from Earth aboard a massive transport vessel filled with human civilians, engineers, scientists, and administrators who began establishing permanent settlements on worlds throughout the Thesia system. His passengers were not military personnel but colonists who intended to make their homes in territory that had been secured by human military forces and would remain under human protection indefinitely. Dr. Kim Do-yeon led teams of human researchers who began comprehensive studies of Valari biology, technology, and social structures. Her work was presented as scientific cooperation that would benefit both species, but Yoon Ji-ho recognized the systematic intelligence gathering that conquerors conducted to better understand and control subject populations. The humans wanted to know everything about Valari capabilities and limitations. Communications Officer Yang Sori intercepted human transmissions back to Earth and learned that Admiral Kim's fleet was just the first wave of a much larger human expansion into this region of the galaxy. Additional military units were already en route along with colony ships, industrial vessels, and administrative personnel who would establish permanent human control over dozens of star systems. The humans established what they called the Thesia Protection Zone with Admiral Kim as the military governor and Captain Lee as the civilian administrator. Valari government officials were informed that they would continue to manage local affairs under human supervision. But all decisions regarding defense, trade, and interstellar relations would be made by human authorities who understood the complex realities of galactic politics. Velthari met privately with her closest advisors and learned that resistance was not a realistic option. The humans had demonstrated their military superiority against the Keth Empire, and their technological capabilities were far beyond anything the Valari could hope to match. More importantly, the humans had saved her people from complete extermination, and any attempt to force them to leave would likely result in the same fate that had befallen the Keth. Engineer O's construction teams began building permanent human cities on Valari worlds, using architectural designs that were both beautiful and unmistakably military in nature. The human settlements were positioned to control transportation routes, communication networks, and resource extraction sites, while providing their inhabitants with all the comforts of Earth civilization, adapted to local environmental conditions. Yang Sori discovered that the dimensional beacon was not unique to the Thesia system, but was part of a network of similar devices that had been placed throughout the galaxy by an ancient civilization that no longer existed. The humans had responded to beacon activations before, and each time they had followed the same pattern of rescue, protection, and gradual absorption of the rescued species into an expanding human empire. Captain Bai Jinho explained to Yun Jiho that the human approach to interstellar relations was based on practical experience, rather than idealistic theories about cooperation between equals. Species that could defend themselves were treated as allies and trading partners, while species that required protection became clients whose survival depended on maintaining good relationships with their human protectors. The transformation of Valari society began immediately as human administrators introduced new technologies, economic systems, and educational programs that would integrate Valari worlds into the broader human sphere of influence. The changes were presented as improvements that would benefit everyone, but they were designed to make Valari independence impossible, even if the humans eventually decided to withdraw their protection. Dr. Kim's research teams made remarkable discoveries about Valari biotechnology and artistic capabilities that had potential applications throughout human space. These innovations were shared freely with Earth authorities under agreements that gave human corporations exclusive rights to develop and market Valari discoveries outside the Thesia system. High Counselor Velthari received reports from Valari, intelligence operatives who had managed to make contact with other species that had used dimensional beacons in the past. The reports confirmed her worst fears about the true nature of the ancient devices and the price that civilizations paid for summoning human protection. Every species that had activated a beacon had eventually become part of the human empire, their independence traded for survival. Yang Sori made one final discovery that explained the true purpose of the dimensional beacon network and the role that humanity played in galactic history. The ancient civilization that had created the beacons had not been trying to provide a rescue service for threatened species. They had been creating a system for identifying and recruiting the most dangerous predators in the galaxy to serve as enforcers for a cosmic protection racket. The humans were not rescuers or conquerors in the traditional sense. They were the galactic equivalent of a natural disaster that could be summoned to eliminate threats, but could never be controlled or dismissed once they had been called. The beacon did not summon help. It summoned death, and the Valari Republic had learned too late that some prices were higher than extinction itself. As the human fleet settled into permanent positions around SciFiPrime and construction began, on installations that would last for thousands of years, Admiral Kim transmitted a message to Earth confirming the successful pacification of another sector of space. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, another desperate civilization would eventually discover the ruins where a beacon waited to offer salvation at a price that no one could afford to pay.